Today, we will recap 2014 an action, drama, comedy film, titled Badass. This movie tells the story of Frank Vega, a Vietnam War veteran whose life is turned upside down when a small fight on a bus leads him to uncover a large-scale criminal case. So, make sure you watch this video till the end, for a better experience. The movie opens with an old man named Frank Vega, who is an ordinary citizen living in California, United States. Every day he takes the bus through 144th Street to do his activities, until one day on the bus, Frank saw two thugs who arrogantly asked for a seat to one of the passengers on the bus, who was an old grandfather. When the thugs were about to punch him, Frank immediately held his hand, and told the two thugs to sit in the empty back seat, while Frank himself moved to the front seat. However, they clearly did not accept, so they started a fight. The incident on the bus was recorded by one of the passengers, and immediately went viral on YouTube. Because of his heroic actions, Frank became famous and was nicknamed Badass. Even Frank's popularity also made him a police acquaintance, until he was interviewed on TV with his mother, Juanita. Since then Frank has regained the spirit in his life. However, Frank, who was just starting to feel his life improving, suddenly had to fall back, after his mother died. When Frank was cleaning up his things, his police friend named Millark came to give his condolences and gave him a t-shirt with a picture of him nicknamed Badass. Frank ended up staying at his mother's house with his best friend and fellow Vietnam War veteran, Klondike. In the evening they chatted over drinks. Klondike here thanked Frank for letting him stay. He then gave a flash disk and asked Frank to keep it in his late mother's safe deposit box. After that Klondike left for a while to buy cigarettes, but on the way back he was intercepted by two thugs, namely Terrence and Sebastian. They asked for the flash disk that Klondike was carrying, which seemed to hold confidential data. But Klondike was silent. When Sebastian pointed his gun, Klondike resisted and managed to subdue them both. But Sebastian, who still held the gun, shot Klondike in the chest and killed him. Frank, who knew that, was even more sad, and felt that the world and happiness were not on his side. After taking Klondike's belongings at the police station, Frank stopped at the mini-market to buy a drink, but because he didn't have enough money, Frank promised the shop owner to pay it off tomorrow, but was immediately rejected by the shop owner. Shortly thereafter came three thugs who were going to rob. Frank told them nicely to leave immediately, but because they were stubborn, Frank immediately taught him a valuable lesson. Realizing Frank had just helped him, the shop owner finally gave the beer for free to Frank. On the way home, Frank met his neighbor who condoled the death of Klondike, and also told him about her brother who was killed not far from there by thugs. According to him, the police have failed to maintain security, because there can be repeated acts of crime in the residential neighborhood. Arriving home, Frank drank his beer on the terrace, and was greeted by the neighbor's son whose language was very lacking in ethics. Shortly after his father, Chris, told him to come in, who turned out to be equally devoid of manners. After that, Millark came to visit again and reminded Frank to stay away from the commotion, like the incident at the mini-market. But Frank replied, he did it to defend the weak. But Millark insisted that it was the job of the police. Here Frank asked if the police had found who killed Klondike, but Millark could only answer that the case was still in process, because there were so many crimes that occurred there and had not been resolved. In the morning, Frank went to the police station to ask about the progress of the Klondike murder case. One of the officers said that he would investigate the death of Klondike and asked Frank to return home. However, a moment later Frank saw the officer enter the room and just sit around playing cards with his friend. Realizing that he couldn't rely on the police, Frank took matters into his own hands to solve the Klondike case. Wearing his signature blue t-shirt, with an inscription on the back that contained a phrase of reproach, Frank casually entered the crime scene where his colleague was killed. There he found bullet casings and also a necklace belonging to Terrence, which was thrown from his neck when the Klondike attacked. After that Frank went to a flea dealer who immediately recognized the two objects. The bullet casings came from a gun that was only owned by the authorities and certainly not sold in stores, while the necklace was a pendant with a photo of a woman the flea dealer often saw in church. The flea dealer then told the location of the husband and wife a few meters from his shop. Frank was also asked to be careful because many thugs were hanging around there. Arriving there Frank only met Terrence's wife, and immediately gave her the pendant. Knowing Frank was looking for her husband, his wife's response was unexpected. She asked Frank to convey a message to Terrence to remember his 3 young children. She even told him where Terrence usually gathered, which was near the basketball court. Immediately after that, Frank went to the basketball court that was talked about, and asked the people there where Terrence was. However, they all arrogantly ignored Frank and even insulted him, which made Frank angry and immediately gave them a raw deal. Until finally making them admit to knowing Terrence but not knowing what he was doing, and where he was now, but Frank was advised to meet someone named Ronaldo in apartment number 85, who might know where Terrence was. Arriving at the apartment, Frank immediately broke in and only met his friend Ronaldo. He said that Ronaldo was rarely in the apartment, and told Frank that Ronaldo always came to the Scorpion Bar every morning. Elsewhere, the mayor of Los Angeles, William, met his subordinate named Panther, who was also a thug boss. Will blamed Panther for not being able to get a flash disk containing William's confidential information, and urged him to get it immediately. Later that night, while taking out the trash, Frank saw Chris, who had left the house after a fight with his wife, Amber. Frank ends up helping to treat a cut on Amber's nose, due to domestic violence from her husband. They struck up a conversation as well as Martin, who became increasingly close to Frank. The next morning, Frank goes to the Scorpion Bar to look for Ronaldo. But because his face is much more thug than the thugs there, making people in the bar immediately confront him, so Frank is forced to fight them. After that, Frank went up to the second floor and finally met Ronaldo, who was busy dating 2 women. At first, Frank asked nicely where Terrence was, but Ronaldo threatened him with a small knife, making Frank angry and almost threw him out the window. Frank finally got information that Terrence was often at the massage parlor. On the way home, Millark came back to Frank and took him around on patrol. It turns out that the police have known the detective action that Frank has been doing lately. Millark then asked Frank to stop the action, because it is the duty of the police. He also told Frank that the head of the police almost issued an arrest warrant for the actions taken by Frank. Frank, who heard that, became very annoyed, and asked to get out of the car, even though his action so far was only to find out who was the killer of his good friend. Arriving home, what was Frank's surprise when he saw his living room very messy, and suddenly a large man locked Frank from behind, and asked for a flash disk hidden by Frank. Frank pretended not to know, and Frank was immediately slammed, however. That's it. Out of curiosity as to how important the contents of the flash disk given by Klondike were, Frank examined the data on the flash disk with the help of Martin, which turned out to contain construction permit documents in Los Angeles along with a list of recipients of funds, but of all the company lists there was one name that was a bit strange and got the most money, namely Panther. After that, Frank continued his search for Terrence to the massage place. He then chose a masseuse named Tatiana, and asked if she knew Terrence. Tatiana then replied that they had been dating but now had broken up, after saying that Tatiana asked another masseuse to replace her, because she said she had business. However, Frank realized something was strange, so he followed Tatiana back home. Frank then sneaked in through the back door and heard the sound of people having sex, which turned out to be Terrence and Tatiana. Not having time to ask, Terrence pointed his gun, but instead aimed at Tatiana's body, which made Frank immediately smash Terrence's head against the wall and ask why Terrence killed his friend. But because Terrence was silent, Frank ruthlessly inserted Terrence's finger into the garbage crusher in the sink, making him open his mouth. It turns out, all these orders from Fanter, Terrence and Sebastian were ordered to kill Klondike and take his flash disk. According to Terrence's information, tomorrow night Fanter will come to a place called Bergamon Love. Frank returned home to make plans. Near the house, Frank saw Amber arguing with her husband. Frank immediately came and broke up. But Chris, who saw F-Tank, immediately wanted to get rid of him too, but it was clear that his muscle strength was much softer than Frank, and Frank made him bend his knees easily, then kicked him out of the house. After that, Frank met Millark and gave Klondike's flash disk to be examined. Millark was also warned not to show the data in it to anyone, because Klondike was killed by the flash disk. Frank then went to church to confess his sin in front of the priest, about the revenge he would take. After that, Frank went to Bergamon Love to meet the killers of his good friends, Sebastian and Panther. But arriving there, suddenly, Frank woke up tied to a chair and began to be tortured, because he did not want to tell where his flash disk was. Panther explains that if the data inside contains cooperation with city officials, which is certainly related to massive corruption. Frank still kept his mouth shut, so he was tortured with electric current to the maximum level, and the impatient Panther threatened to kill Amber and Martin. Panther would then go to Amber's house, and at the same time as a Vietnam War veteran Frank, who must have experienced torture worse than this, he easily untied his bonds and threw a lighter from his pocket towards a gasoline drum, thus making a powerful explosion. Although Frank was cut, he was still able to escape from the warehouse explosion, and chased the Panther, who escaped on the bus he had just taken. Behind, Frank also chased Panther with a bus, so a bus chase ensued, and they damaged a lot of property on the streets. Until finally they faced each other and there was a bullfight. Even though they both had accidents, Frank and Panther were still able to get out safely. Panther went straight to Amber's house followed by Frank, but accidentally on the road, Frank met two thugs who humiliated Frank on the bus at the beginning of the movie. They intended to take revenge on Frank, but still they failed, because they were too weak. Unfortunately, Panther arrived at Amber's house first and was going to attack her, but fortunately, Frank soon came to fight Panther until the end. After that incident, with the contents of the data from the Klondike flash disk, the police managed to break the case of massive corruption in the city of Los Angeles, and arrested the mastermind of the case, namely Los Angeles Mayor William. On the other hand, for Frank's brave actions, he was awarded by the police, and after that he had a new family with Amber and Martin. After a long time of feeling the bitterness of life, he can finally have the good life he has always wanted, and the movie ends. Thank you for watching this movie recap. I hope you had fun and got a clear summary of the movie's storyline. If you liked this recap, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more movie recaps and other content. Your support allows us to continue making quality videos like this. Thanks for watching, and see you tomorrow.